What if you were running out of options, and every resource you had seemed to be draining away? In those moments of desperation, it can feel like there's no way forward. Yet, the story of a widow in the Bible offers a powerful reminder that God's provision often comes in ways we don't expect. Life can feel like it's unraveling, but God has a way of stepping in when we least anticipate it. At Story of Grace, we explore the miraculous ways that God provides, showing that even in our toughest moments, His intervention can change everything. Today, we dive into the story of the widow and her oil to discover how God's provision transformed her life. The widow's desperate situation. Imagine waking up to the crushing reality of your world falling apart. Every aspect of your life seems to be slipping through your fingers. For the widow, this was her daily existence. Her husband had passed away, and with no source of income, the debts he left behind began to drown her in despair. In ancient times, without a husband, a woman's survival often depended on her ability to care for her family or seek the assistance of others. But now, her situation had worsened to the point where she faced the heartbreaking possibility of losing her sons. Her creditors, relentless in their demands, had come to claim her children as payment for the debt. No parent should ever have to face this kind of unbearable decision, sacrificing their own children in exchange for something as cold and transactional as debt repayment. But in the midst of this overwhelming darkness, something remarkable happened. Rather than giving in to hopelessness, the widow turned to the one person she thought could provide the help she needed, Elisha the prophet. This wasn't a simple cry for help. It was an expression of deep anguish combined with a flicker of hope. She wasn't just looking for a financial bailout. She was seeking something more profound, divine intervention. Even in her desperation, she clung to the hope that there was something beyond what her eyes could see. And God, in His timing, was about to reveal that what seemed impossible to her was never beyond His ability to transform. What appeared to be a hopeless, irreversible situation was about to become the stage for an extraordinary display of God's power and provision. Elisha's unexpected solution. When the widow approached Elisha with her desperate plea, she must have expected a solution. Perhaps something like an immediate financial donation or a miraculous windfall of wealth. However, God's ways are often far different from what we imagine. Rather than offering her a large sum of money or arranging for someone to settle her debt, Elisha posed a question that seemed completely out of place. "What do you have in your house?" In the midst of such a dire crisis, the widow had to process this strange question. How could the little she had in her home possibly solve the monumental problem she faced? To her, the very idea seemed disconnected from the gravity of her situation. She was being asked about what she had, but the answer seemed so insignificant compared to the mountain of debt she was facing. Yet in that moment, the widow's response was key. She told Elisha about the small jar of oil she had left, a humble and seemingly insignificant resource. But Elisha didn't dismiss it. Instead, he saw the potential in it. Sometimes, God's provision doesn't come in the form we expect. We may be looking for the grand solution, but often God uses the smallest things, the most overlooked resources, to spark His miraculous work. The widow's faith in sharing even what seemed like nothing became the turning point in her story. By acknowledging what she had, even in its meager state, She opened the door for God to do something extraordinary. What initially appeared to be a simple jar of oil was the key to an unexpected breakthrough, one that would change the course of her life forever. The instructions for the miracle. God's ways often defy human logic. In this case, Elisha's instructions to the widow seemed absurd. Instead of offering her financial help, Elisha asked her to do something that, in her dire circumstances, would have sounded like an impossible and strange request. "Go and borrow as many empty jars as you can from your neighbors," Elisha instructed her. At first glance, this must have seemed bewildering. She had one small jar of oil, and now she was being told to gather empty jars from people around her. She could have easily questioned how this action would lead to any kind of solution. After all, how could collecting empty containers fix her desperate financial situation? However, in her faith, the widow didn't hesitate. She trusted Elisha and obeyed without understanding how it could possibly work. Sometimes, God's instructions don't make immediate sense, especially when they ask us to step outside our comfort zone or do something that seems illogical. Yet her obedience, even when the task appeared trivial, became the catalyst for the miraculous. When the widow began pouring the small amount of oil from her jar into the borrowed vessels, the miraculous began to unfold. The oil, rather than running out, continued to flow, filling every jar she had gathered. This miracle wasn't just about the oil itself, it was about the widow's obedience to follow God's plan, even when it seemed nonsensical. In that obedience, God revealed the power of His provision, something that could not have happened if she had allowed doubt to keep her from acting. The oil never ran dry, and the jars were filled, marking the beginning of her breakthrough. God's provision is often beyond our understanding. When we look at this story, it's clear God doesn't always provide the way we expect. The widow's small jar of oil didn't seem like much, but God's provision was far beyond her understanding. The miracle wasn't just in the oil, but in her willingness to follow God's instructions, even when they didn't make sense. Sometimes, what seems like a tiny gift or an insignificant resource in our lives can become the key to a massive breakthrough. God is not limited by our expectations. He's always working in ways we don't fully understand, and that's where faith plays a huge role. The miracle continues. Once all the jars were filled, Elisha told the widow to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and live on the rest. This wasn't a one-time miracle. It was the beginning of a new season in her life. The provision she received wasn't just for that moment. It was for the future. Can you imagine the relief she must have felt knowing that not only was her immediate crisis solved, but her future was now secure? God didn't just meet her need, He provided abundantly, setting her up for a future filled with hope. The importance of faith and obedience. Faith and obedience are powerful keys to unlocking God's provision. The widow didn't hesitate or second guess. She followed the instructions without knowing how it would work. When we act in faith, even when we don't fully understand the plan, we open ourselves up to miracles. The widow's simple act of faith, borrowing jars, became the vehicle for God's abundant blessing. How often do we hold back in faith, thinking God can't use what we have? This story shows that with God, even the smallest things are powerful. God sees and cares for our needs. This miracle also shows us that God sees us. The widow wasn't alone in her struggle. Even when it felt like the world was against her, God saw her need and responded with love. There may be moments in your life where you feel unseen or forgotten, but God knows exactly where you are. He knows your heart, your needs, and your struggles. And just like the widow, He is ready to meet you right where you are, bringing you the provision you need. Thank you for watching and reflecting on this incredible story of God's provision. We hope it has inspired you to trust God, even when it seems like there's no way forward. His provision is greater than anything we can imagine, just as it was for the widow. If this story encouraged you, don't forget to subscribe to Story of Grace. We bring you more powerful messages of faith, hope, and inspiration every week. Join us and stay connected for more stories of God's amazing grace.